You come here believing the problem is that you care too much, that you feel too deeply, that you are too available, too open, too responsive to the emotional weather of others. But what I want you to understand before anything else is that availability is not a moral virtue, it is a psychological posture. And like all postures of the psyche, it creates a field around you. That field invites certain figures, certain dynamics, certain archetypes to approach and take form. When you are always available, you do not merely offer help, you announce a location, you say, without words, I am here, I am open, I can be reached. And the unconscious hears this far more clearly than any conscious intention. The empath does not suffer because they are sensitive. They suffer because their sensitivity has never been bound, and what is unbound becomes accessible. What is accessible becomes usable, and what is usable is eventually consumed. You see, the psyche does not operate according to moral fairness. It operates according to energy, according to pressure, according to imbalance, where there is an excess of receptivity and a lack of containment. The unconscious of others will lean, intrude, discharge. This is not cruelty, it is physics. The unreachable empath is not someone who has hardened. That is the great misunderstanding. They are not cold, they are not detached from feeling, they are no longer open in the same direction. Their energy has turned inward. Their availability has been withdrawn from the outer world and reclaimed by the inner one. And when that happens, everything flips. Because the moment you stop being available, you collapse an entire projection system that others were unconsciously relying on. Most people do not relate to you. They relate to the function you perform inside their psyche. For some, you are the container, the one who absorbs their anxiety, their confusion, their unresolved grief. For others, you are the mirror, the one who reflects back goodness, worth, innocence, meaning. For others still, you are the regulator, the one who stabilizes chaos simply by being present. But none of these roles require you as a person. They require access. This is why withdrawal feels so dangerous to the empath at first. Because the ego has been trained to believe that connection equals survival, that availability equals love, that absence equals abandonment. These beliefs are not chosen, they are inherited. They are installed early, often before language, often in families where emotional regulation was outsourced to the child, where the child learned, silently, that harmony depended on their responsiveness. In Sucher system, the child becomes reachable before they become individuated. And this creates a lifelong confusion. If I am not available, who am I? This is the question that terrifies the empath more than pain. But this is also the doorway to transformation. Because availability is not identity. It is adaptation. When you stop being available, you are not removing love, you are removing access to unconscious function. And the unconscious does not react gently when a function disappears. It panics. This is the moment everything flips, not externally at first, but symbolically. The figures who once felt secure become restless. The ones who leaned feel destabilized. The ones who extracted meaning feel empty. And they will respond not with insight but with behavior. Some will accuse you of changing. Some will guilt you. Some will provoke, some will idealize your past self and mourn you while you are still alive. None of this is about you. It is about the collapse of a psychic economy. You were supplying something essential not consciously, but energetically, and when that supply is cut, the system must reorganize. This is why withdrawal feels like betrayal to others and like death to the empath. Because something does die. What dies is the false self, the one formed around availability. In dreams, this stage often appears as abandonment imagery, locked doors, missed calls, empty houses, or as the dreamer standing still while others search frantically. The psyche is rehearsing separation. And separation, psychologically speaking, is not distance, it is differentiation. To be unreachable is not to disappear, it is to no longer be absorbed into the psychic field of others. Think of the sun, it does not chase planets, it does not adjust itself to be closer or warmer on demand, and yet everything organizes around it. When the empath withdraws availability, something similar begins to occur, but only after a painful inversion. At first, the world feels louder, more demanding, as if voices are calling from everywhere. This is because the old pattern is trying to reassert itself. The unconscious hates interruption, but if you remain unavailable, not emotionally reactive, not explanatory, not rescuing, something remarkable begins to happen. The projections fall. People can no longer maintain the image they placed on you, and without that image, they are forced briefly, often unwillingly, to confront their own inner content. This is why withdrawal triggers anger, because anger is often the first defense against self-contact. You must understand, when you stop being available, you do not make others worse. You make them visible, and this visibility is intolerable to many, which is why the empath's final fear emerges here. What if I am alone? But this fear is rooted in a misunderstanding of solitude. Solitude is not the absence of relationship, it is the presence of self. Before this stage, the empath is surrounded but not accompanied, connected but not met, needed but not known. Unreachability changes this completely, because only those who can tolerate your non-function can approach your being. This is why everything flips, not immediately into peace, but into truth. And truth is destabilizing before it is liberating. In the next movement of this lecture, we will descend deeper into what happens inside the empath's psyche. During this withdrawal, how guilt transforms into gravity, how anxiety becomes boundary, and how the shadow reorganizes itself when it is no longer projected outward. For now, stay with this image. You are not disappearing, you are condensing, and condensation is how a center forms. Very well, we continue not by adding something new, but by descending further into what has already begun to reorganize inside you. When availability withdraws, the first thing that rises is guilt, not ordinary guilt, but a deep bodily guilt that does not speak in sentences. It speaks in sensations, tightness in the chest, restlessness, the urge to explain yourself to no one in particular. This guilt does not belong to the present moment. It is ancestral. It is conditioned. It is the residue of an early psychic bargain. The empath was formed in an atmosphere where love was contingent upon responsiveness, where emotional presence was rewarded not with reciprocity, but with relief in others. And so the psyche learned a dangerous equation: if I am reachable, I am safe; if I withdraw, I endanger connection. This is why the moment you stop being available, the nervous system reacts as though a law has been broken, as though you have violated an unspoken commandment. The body expects punishment, loss, abandonment. But what is truly happening is far more subtle and far more important. The psyche is crossing from participation mystique into individuation. Participation mystique is the condition in which the boundaries between self and other are porous. In early life, this is natural, necessary, even, but when it persists into adulthood, it becomes the silent architecture of exploitation. Not because others are evil, but because differentiation never occurred. When you are always available, your psyche is partially living in other people's emotional fields. You feel their moods before you feel your own. You anticipate their needs before they articulate them. You adjust yourself preemptively. This is not empathy. This is psychic fusion. And fusion always demands a breaking point. Unreachability is that breaking point. But the psyche does not step cleanly from fusion into sovereignty. There is an in-between space, a liminal zone, where old reflexes collide with new instincts. Here, the empath experiences something terrifying: emotional silence, not peace, silence. The phone does not ring. The emotional pull weakens. The familiar urgency dissolves. And without the constant feedback loop of being needed, the ego panics. It asks, am I still valuable if no one is reaching for me? This question is not philosophical, it is existential. It strikes at the core of identity, because the empath's sense of self has been externally confirmed for so long that internal confirmation feels foreign, even suspicious. And yet this silence is not emptiness, it is space. Space is the prerequisite for symbol formation. Without space, the psyche cannot speak in images, it can only react. This is why, during this phase, dreams become vivid, strange, sometimes disturbing. Figures appear who were absent before. The shadow emerges not as aggression, but as withheld energy, as anger that never learned how to stand, as desire that was deferred indefinitely. The unreachable empath begins to dream of doors that do not open, of being watched from a distance, of standing on high ground while others remain below. These are not fantasies of superiority, they are images of differentiation. The psyche is recalibrating altitude, and altitude changes perception. From this new vantage point, the empath begins to see patterns that were previously invisible, not because they were hidden, but because proximity distorted vision. You begin to notice how often others approached you only in moments of need, how rarely curiosity flowed toward your inner world, how conversation moved toward their wounds, their crises, their narratives. This realization can feel cruel, but it is not an accusation. It is an awakening, and awakening is never gentle to the ego. This is the stage where many retreat, where availability returns under a new justification. I'm just being compassionate. I don't want to become cold. I don't want to lose people. But what is being protected here is not love, it is familiarity. True withdrawal does not harden the heart, it strengthens the spine, and this distinction is essential. Coldness is dissociation, unreachability is containment. One numbs feeling, the other redirects it inward. As this containment stabilizes, something extraordinary begins to happen. The empath's emotional energy, once dispersed, starts to accumulate, and energy that accumulates becomes gravitational. This is when the flip begins to accelerate. People who once ignored you begin to notice your absence, not because they miss you, but because the psychic equilibrium has shifted. They feel unanchored, disoriented, drawn, but now the dynamic is reversed. Before, you moved toward others unconsciously, now others move toward you tentatively, cautiously, often clumsily. Some will attempt to provoke emotion, hoping to restore the old access. Some will feign concern, masking curiosity as care. Some will suddenly understand you, mirroring depth they never showed before. This is the unconscious attempting to re-establish a lost circuit, but something in you no longer responds automatically. This is the birth of inner pause. An inner pause is the beginning of power, not power over others, but power over reflex. The empath who remains unreachable long enough begins to feel something unfamiliar, neutrality, not indifference, neutrality. Events no longer hook immediately. Words land without piercing. Emotional bait loses its charge. This is not because you care less, but because you are no longer empty enough to be filled by everything. The shadow, now internalized, begins to integrate. Anger becomes clarity, sadness becomes depth, desire becomes direction. And for the first time, the empath feels weight. Weight is often mistaken for heaviness, but psychologically, weight is presence. It is density of being. This is why the unreachable empath feels intimidating without trying to be, because people sense that they cannot move you easily anymore, that access must now be earned not through need, but through reciprocity. This terrifies those who only know how to connect through imbalance. And so some will leave. This is inevitable, and it is not a failure. Those who leave are not rejecting you. They are encountering the limit of their own relational capacity. But others, fewer, quieter, more grounded, will approach differently. They will not rush, they will not extract, they will not demand availability. They will wait, and waiting is the highest compliment the psyche can offer, because waiting acknowledges sovereignty. In the final movement of this transformation, something profound occurs. The empath stops asking who needs me and begins asking where does my energy belong. This is the axis shift, from reaction to orientation, from service to alignment, from reachability to resonance. And resonance does not chase, it attracts by being itself. In the next part of this lecture, we will enter the deepest layer of this process, how unreachability reorganizes love, intimacy, and destiny itself, how the empath's withdrawal becomes the very condition that allows true union to occur, not through sacrifice, but through mutual recognition. For now, remain with this truth. You did not lose connection when you became unreachable. You lost illusion, and illusion always collapses before the real can appear, we move now into a deeper chamber of the psyche, one that is rarely spoken of because it cannot be moralized, and it cannot be romanticized. It is the chamber where love itself is redefined not as attachment, not as loyalty, not as sacrifice, but as recognition. When the empath becomes unreachable, something subtle yet seismic happens to their experience of love. The old form collapses first, and this collapse feels like grief, because what the empath once called love was often proximity without symmetry. It was closeness built on responsiveness. It was intimacy maintained through emotional labor. It was connection that depended on vigilance. That kind of love does not survive unreachability. And so, when availability withdraws, the empath may initially feel that love has vanished from their life. The warmth fades, the intensity dulls, the familiar emotional highs disappear. This is not because love has ended. It is because the nervous system is detoxing from over-involvement. You see, intensity is not depth. Intensity is often the sign of imbalance of one psyche leaning too far into another. Depth, by contrast, is quiet. It does not demand constant confirmation. It does not spike and crash. It endures. But the empath has been trained to confuse intensity with meaning. This is why, in the early stages of unreachability, relationships feel strangely flat or distant. The old emotional feedback loops are gone, and the new ones have not yet formed. This is the desert phase, and deserts are not empty. They are precise. They strip away what cannot survive without excess. In this phase, the empath confronts a painful realization. Many relationships were sustained not by mutual presence, but by their availability. Remove the availability, and the structure collapses. This realization wounds the heart, but it heals the psyche. Because now, love can no longer be defined by how much you give, how much you endure, or how much you absorb. It must be defined by whether the other can meet you where you stand. This is where projection begins to reverse. Before unreachability, others projected strength, safety, meaning, and emotional coherence onto the empath. The empath carried these images unknowingly, mistaking projection for connection. Now, as availability withdraws, these projections lose their anchor, and when a projection collapses, the one who projected experiences anxiety, confusion, sometimes hostility. They feel as though something essential has been taken from them, but nothing has been taken. What has happened is that the empath has returned something that never belonged to them. This is why unreachability is experienced by others as rejection, even when no rejection has occurred. The empath is no longer performing the unconscious role assigned to them, and without that role, others must confront their own inner figures. This is when the archetype of the unreachable one emerges. In myth, this figure appears again and again not as cruel, but as centered, not as aloof, but as inwardly anchored. Think of the hermit, the alchemist, the oracle, who speaks only when spoken to. These figures do not withdraw because they despise the world. They withdraw because their inner world has become active, and inner activity changes everything. As the empath remains unreachable, Something begins to reorganize at the level of destiny, not fate imposed from outside, but orientation emerging from within. Before, the empath's life path was often shaped by interruption, by emergencies, by detours taken for the sake of others. Their time was porous, their direction easily diverted. Now, for the first time, direction begins to consolidate, not as ambition, not as egoic striving, but as a quiet sense of rightness. Certain paths no longer feel accessible, not because they are forbidden, but because they no longer resonate. Certain people fade not dramatically, but naturally. Certain desires lose urgency. This is the psyche aligning itself with its own center. And the center is not loud. It does not argue. It does not persuade. It does not chase. It simply exerts gravity. This is why the unreachable empath often appears calm to the point of mystery. Their nervous system is no longer scanning for signals. Their attention is no longer dispersed. They are present without being available. And this paradox unsettles those who equate presence with accessibility. But something else begins to happen now, something the empath did not anticipate. True intimacy becomes possible, not with everyone, in fact, with very few, because true intimacy requires two individuated psyches, two centers that can meet without merging, two beings who can remain themselves in proximity. Before unreachability, intimacy was compromised by asymmetry. One gave, one received, one held, one leaned. Now, intimacy must arise from mutual presence. This is rare, and rarity often feels like loneliness at first. The empath may find themselves surrounded by fewer people, but experiencing more reality. Conversations slow down, silence becomes tolerable, words carry weight, and when someone approaches now, they do so differently. They do not rush, they do not demand, they do not test boundaries. They sense that access is no longer automatic. This is the moment the empath realizes something profound. Being unreachable has not made them less lovable. It has made them selectable. Before, anyone could approach because there was no threshold. Now, approach requires attunement. This is not superiority, it is integrity. And integrity changes the structure of love. Love no longer asks, "How much can I give?" It asks, "Is this mutual?" Love no longer proves itself through endurance, it proves itself through presence. Love no longer survives on need, it survives on recognition. This is the moment the empath stops attracting those who are hungry and begins attracting those who are awake. Awake, not in a mystical sense, but awake to themselves. And this awakeness is contagious. Because when someone encounters an empath who is no longer available, no longer rescuing, no longer explaining, they are confronted with their own center or the absence of it. Some will recoil, some will attempt control, some will idealize from afar, but a few will step forward not to take, but to stand, and standing together is the foundation of real relationship. In dreams, this phase often appears as meeting a stranger who feels strangely familiar, or as standing beside someone without speaking, without urgency, or as two figures facing the same horizon. These are images of parallel individuation. The psyche is signaling that union no longer requires sacrifice. But before this transformation completes, there is one final confrontation. The empath must face the most difficult one. It is not with others, it is with their own longing to be needed. Because even after unreachability stabilizes, a subtle temptation remains, the desire to be indispensable, to be chosen because of usefulness, to be valued for emotional labor. This desire is the last remnant of the old identity, and it must be seen, not judged, not suppressed, but integrated. In the final phase of this journey, the empath learns to let go of being special in the old way, so they can become singular in a new one. This is where the transformation completes, not in withdrawal, but in sovereignty. In the final part of this lecture, we will enter that space, the quiet authority that emerges when the empath no longer negotiates their presence, the kind of power that does not announce itself, and the kind of love that no longer asks permission to exist. Stay with this image now. You are no longer the one who waits to be reached. You are the one who stands where others must come into themselves to meet you. And that changes everything. Now we arrive at the final threshold, not a climax, but a settling, not an explosion, but a condensation so complete that movement itself changes meaning. By this stage, the empath no longer experiences unreachability as an act. It is no longer something you do, it is something you are, and this distinction matters, because acts require effort, while states reorganize reality without strain. Earlier, withdrawal demanded vigilance. You had to remind yourself not to respond, not to explain, not to soften the discomfort of others. But now, something deeper has taken over. The impulse to overextend has weakened. The reflex to make yourself available has lost urgency. What once felt like restraint now feels like alignment. This is the moment when sovereignty replaces defense. Sovereignty is often misunderstood as control, but psychologically, sovereignty is not domination. It is coherence. It is the condition in which the inner and outer worlds no longer contradict each other. Before, the empath's outer behavior often betrayed their inner truth. You felt tired but stayed present. You felt overwhelmed but listened. You felt unseen but continued to see others. This fracture between inner signal and outer response was the true source of exhaustion. Now, that fracture has sealed, and when the psyche becomes coherent, it generates authority. Authority does not need to assert itself. It does not persuade. It does not seek consensus. It simply occupies space fully. This is why the unreachable empath feels different even in silence. Because silence now has density. It is no longer absence. It is presence without leakage. Others sense this immediately. They may not be able to articulate it, but they feel it in the body. Conversations slow around you. People choose their words more carefully. Emotional theatrics lose traction. This is not because you intimidate them. It is because you no longer participate unconsciously. Participation mystique has dissolved. You are no longer psychically fused with the emotional fields around you. You can feel without absorbing. You can witness without intervening. You can care without carrying. This is mastery of empathy. Not the empath as sponge, but the empath as vessel. A vessel holds without spilling itself, and now something unexpected happens to power. Power no longer feels like something you lack or must protect yourself from. It no longer feels dangerous or corrupting. It no longer belongs to others. It feels neutral. This neutrality is crucial because it means power has been internalized. When power is external, you fear it. When it is internal, you respect it. This is why the unreachable empath stops fearing abandonment. Abandonment requires dependency, and dependency has ended not through rejection of others, but through the reclamation of self. You are no longer waiting for someone to stay to confirm your worth. You are no longer measuring connection by continuity. You are no longer scanning for signs of withdrawal, because you are no longer extended beyond yourself. This does not mean you no longer experience loss, but loss now moves differently through you. Earlier, loss felt like annihilation, like a collapse of identity. Now, loss feels like separation without disintegration. Something leaves, but you remain intact. This is psychological adulthood. And adulthood, in the Jungian sense, is not about independence alone. It is about responsibility to the self, not the ego, not the persona, not the empath identity you once wore as armor, but the deeper organizing principle of your psyche. The self does not demand availability, it demands alignment, and alignment changes destiny. At this stage, the empath notices a subtle but profound shift in timing. Opportunities appear without force. Encounters feel strangely synchronous. Things arrive when they are needed, not when they are demanded. This is not magical thinking, it is psychological economy. When your energy is no longer dissipated, it becomes directional, and direction attracts corresponding reality. You no longer chase meaning. Meaning meets you. You no longer audition for belonging. Belonging emerges where recognition exists, and recognition is rare, but it is exact. This is why relationships that form now feel different. They are quieter, slower, less dramatic, but also more real. There is no urgency to prove yourself, no compulsion to be exceptional, no need to rescue, fix, or redeem. You can simply be, and being is no longer passive, it is active presence. This is the paradox. By becoming unreachable, you become fully present, present to yourself first, and from this presence, love changes one final time. Love is no longer something you give to be connected. It is something that arises when connection already exists. Love is no longer earned through usefulness. It is recognized through mutual clarity. Love no longer asks you to disappear. It requires you to remain. This is the love that can withstand silence, that does not panic at distance, that does not need constant reassurance. This is love between two centers, and such love does not consume. It stabilizes. The empath who reaches this stage no longer wonders whether they are too much or not enough. Those questions belong to a psyche that was negotiating for space. You now occupy your space, and occupation does not require apology. In dreams, this final integration often appears as standing at the center of a structure, sometimes a temple, sometimes a house, sometimes an open landscape, while others move around you. You are not directing them. You are not stopping them. You are simply there. This is the image of the self, not isolated, not merged, centered. And from the center, everything else organizes naturally. You may notice that fewer people can follow you here, not because the path is secret, but because it requires relinquishing the benefits of unconsciousness. Some will always prefer the comfort of projection to the challenge of selfhood. That is not your burden. Your task is not to remain reachable. Your task is to remain true. And truth, once embodied, does not argue. It radiates. So when everything flipped, it was never about others losing access to you. It was about you gaining access to yourself, and that access, once reclaimed, cannot be taken away. You are no longer the empath who waits to be needed. You are the one who stands whole, whether approached or not, and from that wholeness, life finally begins to meet you not as demand, not as burden, but as dialogue. That is the moment unreachability completes its work, not by isolating you from the world, but by returning you to your own center, where the world can finally meet you without distortion.